On July 29, 1778, 12 warships were sighted off the coast of Aquidneck Island. The British soldiers who saw them must have been filled with dread. The ships were flying French flags. The British had occupied Newport in December of 1776, virtually without a fight. They sought the large harbour to winter their ships in, and wished to use Newport as a base from which to strike at Providence and Boston. Just 2 years later, though, the course of the war had changed. The British had surrendered at Saratoga in 1777, and the Continental Army was proving itself on the battlefield. At this time, General John Sullivan was commanded to retake Newport from the British. To aid him, a squadron of warships and some 4,000 soldiers under the command of Comte d'Estaing was dispatched from France. This would be the first time that French and colonial forces had worked together. On the other side of the fight were the British forces under Major General Piggott. He commanded 6,700 soldiers, a mix of British regulars and veteran Hessian mercenaries. These were dangerous troops, but they were outnumbered by the colonial militia, numbering some 10,000. The British immediately withdrew inside the walls of Newport, allowing the Americans to occupy Butts Hill and other high ground. Bad news arrived for the Americans too, however. The French fleet had been forced to fight an arriving British fleet under Admiral Howe. During the fight, a storm had come in and damaged both fleets. The French fleet stopped briefly to tell Sullivan they were leaving and headed for Boston to get repairs. The Marquis de Lafayette rode to Boston to try and persuade d'Estaing to come back, but was unsuccessful. Without the French ships and troops, many of the militia fell into despair, packed up their kit, and went home. This left Sullivan with about 4,000 troops, and British reinforcements closing fast. Sullivan gave the order to retreat to the northern side of Aquidneck. Sullivan tried to get his force of 4,000 back to Tiverton, while Piggott pursued with his Hessians and British regulars. Sullivan needed to get his troops off of Aquidneck Island and fast, because Henry Clinton and several thousand British reinforcements were coming. As the Americans retreated on the night of August 26th, they set a defensive line across the island to protect their retreat and deny the British the high ground in the north. The Americans split their forces into two sections. The western section was commanded by Major General Nathaniel Greene, who had the 1st Rhode Island set up about half a mile further forwards, under Brigadier General James Varnum. The American east was under the command of Brigadier General John Glover, who had his men set up behind a stone wall overlooking Quaker Hill. The British also split their forces into two forces, sending the Hessians up the west road under General Friedrich Wilhelm von Lossberg, and the regulars up the east road under Major General Francis Smith. Smith came into contact first when his troops came under fire from a windmill near Quaker Hill. The British sent the 54th and provincial troops to reinforce Smith. The Americans were also reinforced, but were still forced back to Quaker Hill. Later, when a Hessian troop threatened to outflank Quaker Hill entirely, it was abandoned and the troops retreated all the way to Glover's lines. Smith sent a probing attack after them, but was repulsed and decided that Glover's lines were too strong. The fighting in the east ended shortly afterwards. The Hessians advanced on the west and were met by the American Light Corps under Colonel John Lawrence. Although Lawrence received reinforcements from Sullivan, he was pushed back when Lossberg rushed Lawrence's position on Turkey Hill. Lossberg then began to hammer Greene's lines with cannon fire, made worse by the fact 3 small British ships had negotiated the passage between Aquidneck and Prudence Islands and also began bombarding Greene's troops. Lossberg then twice attacked the 1st Rhode Island and was twice repulsed in bitter hand-to-hand fighting. The British ships, meanwhile, were driven off by the gun battery at Conanicut Island and Greene's own artillery. Greene then counterattacked using the 2nd Rhode Island, a brigade of Massachusetts militia, and the troops that had attacked Smith earlier. Lossberg retreated to the summit of Turkey Hill, and by the evening, Greene's men held a position just 300 paces from Turkey Hill. Greene made a last attempt to defeat Lossberg, this time attacking Lossberg's left flank, but was driven off by Hessian and provincial reinforcements. The battle ended in a victory for the British, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The American troops escaped successfully, and the British were forced to tie up useful troops in the defence of Newport, which they later abandoned in 1779. Worse was the fact that the Americans and French were now working together. They would continue to do so until the eventual defeat of General Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown. Shortly afterwards, the war would end, with the British having been defeated and the American colonies having gained their freedom.